On today's Locked On Giants podcast, what questions are we left with after the spring football practice is concluded? I'll go over some of mine coming up next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, credentialed member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for New York Giants on SI. Find my written work over at si.com/NFL/Giants. And as always, a big welcome on in to my everydayers, my Blue Crew community members, my newcomers, and everybody in between. Thank you for spending part of your day with us here on the Locked On Giants podcast. And please, if you're not already to subscribe, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the little bell for notifications every time I post a new video. And if you wouldn't mind, like the video. It all helps us out at the end of the day. On today's Locked On Giants podcast, what are some of the unanswered questions that kind of linger or remain before the Giants get to training camp? Now, the Giants won't be at training camp until I believe July 24th is the first practice, which means they would probably report around the 23rd. But what are the biggest questions? What didn't we get answers to? Now, before I get into my list of questions, it's important to remember what head coach Brian Daboll said about the whole process and the whole point of the spring. And that was that jobs weren't meant to be won or lost during the spring. So, you're not in pads, obviously. There's no contact. So the coaches aren't necessarily going to be able to tell who, improved on the offensive line, for example, who didn't. They're not going to be able to really gauge receivers versus cornerbacks because there's no contact allowed. So the receivers have a little bit of advantage and, so on and so forth. You don't see running plays and so on. So it wasn't about winning for job or competing for jobs. It was more about establishing reps and depth chart placement. So, you look at who's going to be on the first team, who's going to work on the second team, and so on. And that all comes together based on how guys know assignments and how they execute the assignments, what they are allowed to execute in the spring. So that was the purpose of the entire spring. That and also a chance to make any new installs on offense, defense, and special teams. So that being said, I'm not going to necessarily sit here and talk about position battles and all that stuff, but I'm going to just kind of go over the main questions that we right now don't have answers to. So let's get it kicked off here. The first one I know a lot of people are going to wonder about, I'm wondering about it too, is the offensive line. Now, I just got through saying that, jobs are not won or lost in the spring, but there's some legitimate questions about, will the offensive line be better? What combination will we see in week one? And will they be better? All right. So here's what we can tell you about, the offensive line situation. Do I think it will be better? I do. And I say that because, I am a big fan of how Carmen Bricillo has taught these guys. Carmen Bricillo is not a yeller and a screamer. He doesn't kind of, strike fear into the hearts of guys, to where they're walking on eggshells. He is a teacher. And like any good teacher, they demand all that their student has to give them, and they in return will give them all that they have. And in this case, if somebody doesn't want to give Carmen Bricillo all that they have, he's not going to keep them around. He's going to get them out of here. So with the offensive line, I think if I had to take a guess right now as to how that unit potentially is going to look from left to right, I'm going to go with Andrew Thomas at left tackle, Aaron Stinney at left guard, John Michael Schmitz at center, John Runyon Jr. at right guard, and Jermaine Illuminor at right tackle. Now, some of you are saying, but Pat, Jermaine Illuminor didn't work at right tackle all spring. Why are you putting him in there? And what about Evan Neal? Well, Evan Neal, I'm going to get to in my next question, actually. But the reason why I say Illuminor at right tackle is that's why he was brought in here. And never mind that he didn't practice there all spring long. The guy knows how to play the position, right? He played it last year for the Raiders. It's not like he forgot how to play it. So, that might be a little overblown, I think, in the fact that he didn't work there all off season. He worked at left guard, obviously, in the event that Evan Neal is ready to go and last the entire season. So it was more or less a brush up, if you will, at left guard for Jermaine Illuminor. Now, since I opened the door about Evan Neal, let's make that question number 2. What's going to be his status? Now, I know what the Giants told us. I know what Brian Daboll told us about Evan Neal and why they backed off of him. And it's feasible. I'm not saying that it's not. But here's what it's not sitting well with me. All right. Evan Neal, for the first 2 practices that the media had availability, he was doing some stuff, which was basically individual work. So it's not like he was doing a whole lot to begin with. And now, comes the final OTA that the media has access to, the 2 mini camp practices that they have access to. And now all of a sudden, he's not doing anything. And I'm sitting here and I'm saying, okay, so one of 2 things had to happen. Evan Neal either had a setback, which Brian Daboll said was not the case. He simply said that they were backing off to allow him, to be ready for the start of training camp, or there's something more brewing there. I'm not, trying to stir up a conspiracy or anything like that, but this is just not adding up. All right. The guy's got 6 weeks off. You mean to tell me that, he couldn't continue doing limited stuff for another, couple of weeks? Something's just not adding up there. I'm not sure what it is. And then I talk about the body language of Evan Neal and how he kind of looked dejected and alone. I can't put my finger on it, folks, but something's just not right there. I hope that Evan Neal is okay. I hope that he is ready to go by the start of training camp. I hope that the body language that, and I'm not the only one who read it this way too. There were other people in the media. We all were talking about it, how he looks like he's kind of separated from the rest of the team. Let's hope that this guy is right by the time they have to start training camp, because Evan Neal cannot afford to lose more time, more practice reps. He has lost enough. This guy's got to hit the ground running. And, I'd like to think it's going to happen, but the simple fact remains that he didn't hit the ground running last year or the year before. What makes us think that he's going to do so now, especially since he, hasn't had a chance to really do the on-field practicing? So that, to me, is a really, really big question. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, I don't have Evan Neal in as the starting right tackle. I probably am wrong. I hope I'm wrong about that. Just my gut feeling. All right, coming up, more unanswered questions that I'm going to try to answer for you, but they're still unanswered. Don't go anywhere. Hey, Giant fans, passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's guaranteed fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. And with all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay's guaranteed fit only available to U.S. customers. All right, we're continuing our look at the unanswered questions from the Giants spring football practices. Questions that, may not be answered until training camp or the end of training camp. So let's continue onward, and I'll give you the questions and what I think is going to happen. All right, question, I guess this is number 3. What about Daniel Jones? Is he really going to be ready for the start of training camp? And if so, what exactly is he going to be able to do? Now, here's the thing, folks. The way that a player stays off of the PUP list, which is the physically unable to perform list, and it's the active PUP, meaning that if he lands on PUP, he does count against the 90-man roster. So the way to stay off of that is you have to pass a training camp physical. If you do not pass that physical, you go on PUP. If you pass it, you're good. You don't have to worry about PUP until next year. So part of the physical entails the conditioning test. Can you run the sprints? How do you check out physically? And I think they check you out basically from head to toe. So will Daniel Jones be able to run the sprints? Well, judging by how he was moving around in the spring, he seemed to move fine. He was running. He was sort of cutting a little bit. He did not look like a guy who was recovering from a torn ACL. So I believe Jones will be ready to start training camp. I don't see him landing on PUP. Now, the question is how much will he be allowed to do if he does indeed start training camp? Will he be cleared to do everything? Will the coaches say, you know what, let's wait until, I don't know, midsummer, and then we'll let him do everything? That's all going to depend on where he is with his knee, and how much faith that the coaches have in Daniel Jones as far as year 3 in the system. Is there anything he needs to work on? Building up chemistry with his receivers and all that other good stuff. So let's talk about some of those elements. Let's start off with his knowledge of the offense. Now, one thing Daniel Jones has in his favor, obviously, this is year 3 of the same system. So it's not like he's got to get out there and, everything's going to be a blur for him and it's got to slow down and whatnot. He's been in this system. He knows the language. He knows the terminology. He knows most of the receivers. Okay. There are a couple of new guys he has: Theo Johnson, the tight end; Malik Neighbors, the wide receiver. Building up chemistry with those guys, there are things that they can do, including the passing camp that Daniel Jones is going to hold later this month down in Charlotte. They can throw to each other before and after practice, so they can get up to speed fairly quickly. All right, so that shouldn't be a concern as well. So all that being said, you kind of ask yourself and you say, does it make sense for the Giants to give Daniel a couple more weeks? I can make a case for it, but the Giants, if Daniel Jones, if that knee is stable, they're going to just say, you know what, Daniel, we're greenlighting you to do everything. Go ahead and have at it. So I'm curious to see what they do, because they didn't want Daniel participating in 11-on-11 in the springtime when there is no contact. And I'm talking not just on the quarterback, who there's no contact against in practice anyway, but there was no contact where, the defensive line could accidentally push past push somebody from the offensive line into the quarterback. So in other words, it was a little safer for a quarterback in the OTAs and the mini camp. Whereas now when you start getting into pads, you run the risk that, the coaching staff and the training staff was trying to avoid to begin with in the spring. And that is somebody accidentally rolling up on the guy's leg. So at some point, Daniel Jones will be fully cleared. Will it be to start camp? Right now, if I had to take a guess, I would say no. But obviously, Daniel's going to keep working at his rehab. He said he planned to basically stick around during the 6 weeks of downtime and continue his rehab so that he is ready, because he has got a chip on his shoulders, ladies and gentlemen. He is determined to be ready and to start week 1. I say, I think he'll start week 1, but will he be totally ready when they report to training camp? We'll see. I'm not counting on it right now, but we'll see. Hopefully I'm wrong. All right, defensively, let's talk about a defensive question. Cornerback 2. All right, now here's the thing, folks. The coaches said they have confidence in Cordell Flott. Okay, great. So why all offseason have they been trying to add to that position? And not just, a training camp body. We're talking top line guys, all right? Davius White, Darius Williams, Steven Nelson. Those guys aren't just training camp bodies. Those guys would have been instant starters had they been able to sign them. So, why have the Giants been trying to upgrade that spot? Do they still maybe have some concerns about the youth? Now, they've added a couple veterans, obviously the latest one being Trey Herndon. But, this is a case of they're saying one thing, but their actions are kind of saying the other. Now, for all we know, Cordell Flott may go out there and just absolutely answer all the questions that remain, which I hope he does. But you just ask yourself, you're saying this and you're doing that. So how confident are you really in what you have at cornerback? Are you concerned with the lack of experience? Are you concerned with durability issues? What exactly was driving all that you felt it's so necessary to look to bring in a veteran? If you have all this confidence, like you say, in Cordell Flott, as well as the rest of the guys on the roster. I know what you're thinking. You're saying, well, what else are they supposed to say? But again, actions speak louder than words. So I'm curious to see what happens with that. All right, coming up next, I have a few more remaining questions that I walked away from the end of the mini camp with. And as always, I will try to answer those when we come back. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and we're answering questions, unanswered questions that I know I was left with after the Giants mandatory minicamp wrapped up. So let's continue with some of these. Brian Daboll hasn't made the announcement, but he's going to call the plays. Everybody knows it's the worst kept secret of camp. The question I have about that is, how will the play calling change, if at all? Now, you're probably saying to yourself, well, it is Brian Daboll's offensive system, so how much could it possibly change? I mean, it's not like, on the defensive side of the ball where you're going from Wink Martindale's aggressive, exotic blitz, cover zero system to Shane Bowen's get home with the front seven, more zone coverage system. So here's what I mean about the play calling. Despite the fact that so you have a framework as to, what you're going to do. And you have a game plan for every situation. You have multiple plays that you might call based on down and distance, based on where you are on the field and all that stuff. So let's take, for example, the Giants have 1st and 10 and they're at the midfield. What would Daboll call versus what would Kafka call? How much is that going to differ? Now, it might not matter as much as, it sounds like, but you start adding up those little decision-making processes that will vary. Is Kafka a little bit more conservative, a little more daring? Does Daboll, who had a reputation when he was the offensive coordinator in Buffalo of abandoning the run, does he take something a little differently? What's going to be the difference, if any, in the play calling? And is it going to help the Giants or is it going to hurt the Giants? So that's something I'm curious to see how that kind of shakes out. we probably won't start to get answers of that until we get into the season. So that's going to be kind of a season-long project to keep an eye on. All right, another question is the injury status. We talked about Daniel Jones. We talked about Evan Neal, two guys who are coming back from injuries. There were a few other injuries. There were about 20 injuries altogether on the team. How many of those guys are going to be ready, and how many of them are going to be way between now and the start of camp? So specific injuries that come to mind that, the Giants are hoping will be okay, but we still need to take a wait and see approach. Tight end Daniel Bellinger, tight end Jack Stoll, inside linebackers Micah McFadden and Isaiah Simmons. The three receivers that got hurt, particularly Darius Slayton, Bryce Ford Wheaton, Chase Cota, who I think is going to end up on IR because I think he had a broken collarbone. So I'm not sure he's going to be ready to go. So, how quickly are those guys going to be ready? I think Jordan Phillips was recovering from a wrist injury. I'm trying to think who else. I think that those are some of the main names that come to mind. So where are those guys going to be in their rehab and in terms of their readiness for the start of camp? Those are, that's going to be interesting. Now, a clue that we will get as to who might be ready, who might not be ready, who might end up on PUP, who might not end up on PUP, is to watch the transaction wire as we get closer to camp. If you start to see, for example, the Giants signing new tight ends, you know that Jack Stoll and Daniel Bellinger might still be a little limited. If you see the Giants add receivers, you know that, maybe some of those guys aren't going to be ready physically. So that's going to be your clue as to where each position group kind of stands depth-wise. So that's something I'll be watching for sure. Okay, a couple more for you. Will Malik Nabers actually be as good as advertised? Now, I bring this up because last summer we were all gushing about Jalen Hyatt and how he was separating and how he looked so good in camp. And then we get to the regular season and his production kind of, not what we all thought it would be. I don't think that's going to happen with Malik Nabers. I really don't. I mean, you're talking Jalen Hyatt, a third-round pick, Malik Nabers, the 6th overall pick in the first round. But that being said, there are things that Malik Nabers still had to learn. Brian Dable alluded to them. Nabers alluded to them. He's a quick learner. How quickly can they get him up to speed? And once he is up to speed, what are we going to get out of him? Okay. A lot of people are counting on 1,000-yard season from him. I'm just counting on consistency and reliability from the kid. The numbers, if he falls short of 1,000, I won't consider that a failure on his season. I just want consistency. I want him to stay healthy and help move the chains. That's all I'm interested in. But that's just me. You can tell I'm probably not going to play fantasy football this year again, but that's just me. So yeah, is he going to be the real deal? I think he will be. I really do. I mean, it's not like he's putting on a show just to, for the sake of it. This is who he is. All right. The running game, that is a question as well. Now, we didn't see a whole lot of running plays because obviously for that, you need pads on, you need a day where you're allowed to have contact. But how is that pecking order going to shake out? Devin Singletary is going to be the lead in the committee. I could see potentially Tyrone Tracy being the second running back ahead of Eric Gray, who I think will be the third. And I do think the Giants, right now, if it comes down to just Sean Corbin and Dante Miller, I think Miller has the edge. Miller has done some work on kickoff returns. Corbin has not this spring. So if I were writing out the depth chart, that would be my guess as to how the running back rotation might stack up. So we'll see how that plays out. But I would not be surprised if Tyrone Tracy does, settle into that number 2 spot. They really like what he brings, not just as a runner, but also in the passing game. that former receiver in him. He was naturally a receiver and then converted to running back. So I could see him having a big role in that spot. All right, I'll give you one more question before we call it a show. And that is, who's going to take some of the pressure off of Malik Neighbors? Now, what do I mean by that? When the Giants had Saquon Barkley, it was pretty much Barkley and that was it. When they had Odell Beckham Jr., it was pretty much Beckham and that was it. So what I'm getting at is they had really one playmaker on offense that kept opposing defensive coordinators up at night. And once somebody figured out how to stop that playmaker or minimize their impact, that was all she wrote. So who's going to be the guy, the number two, if you will, to help take some of the onus off of Malik Neighbors? You want to give opposing defenses as much as possible to worry about if you're an offensive coordinator. The Giants right now, Malik Neighbors hasn't played an NFL down. We're going on the basis that he's going to be, what we have seen in the spring and what he showed in college. So, are they going to have, say, Tyrone Tracy? Is he going to develop into that guy? Is it going to be Wan'Dale Robinson who develops into that guy? Robinson, by the way, would be my pick. I think Robinson had a very strong camp, flew under the radar, and I think he's a guy who I think is going to open a lot of eyes and surprise a lot of people if he stays healthy. So, these are just a few of the questions. Now, they'll all get sorted out, but, none of them are just, to me, as burning as the offensive line question, which I know a lot of people want to know, and probably the state of the injured guys, who's going to be able to do what. So we'll get answers soon enough. It's 6 weeks away. The 6 weeks are going to fly by because why not? They always fly by, right? So anyway, keep it here on the Locked On Giants podcast. We're wrapping up for the day. We're wrapping up for the week. So I'm going to send you into the weekend. Hope you have fun. Don't forget, Monday, Mike Garafolo is on the show with me. Do not miss it. Have a great one, Giant fans, and I will see you then.